In 1978, China's economy was in crisis and it was searching for a way out. Unexpectedly, it found its answers in the tiny island nation 13,000 times smaller, Singapore. Back then, Chinese media called Singapore a running dog of US imperialism. Yet, fast forward to today, China has sent over 50,000 officials to study Singapore's success. When Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore, he saw something that changed his view completely. It was a one-party government led by the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, and it had built a modern, prosperous society but kept a firm grip on power. This discovery would lead to a relationship that helped shape China's rise into the superpower we see today. But to understand why Singapore's success was so important to China, we need to go back to the time when China was at its lowest point. Back then in 1978, China was very poor. It was struggling and 80% of the country was living on less than $1 a day. To compare the GDP per capita back then, it was $200 for China and $3,500 for Singapore. This is because China was trying to recover from the Cultural Revolution, which ended in 1976, when the previous leader, Mao Zedong, died. Basically, the Cultural Revolution was a time when Mao really wanted to force communist ideas upon the people. So schools were shut down. You had young kids being encouraged to challenge and beat their teachers and parents. Books were being burned. Intellectual people or scientists were being arrested and killed. Deng Xiaoping was the one who emerged after this chaos as China's leader. He knew that China desperately needed change. He wanted a path out, but he needed a blueprint. In November 1978, Deng traveled to Singapore. He was actually not there to do research or to learn about Singapore, but actually there to discuss Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. But there he found a society that thrived despite its lack of natural resources and tiny size. And he asked the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, how do you get Singapore to be so modern and orderly and developed? And Lee Kuan Yew just told Deng Xiaoping, if Singapore can do it, so can China. Because the people in Singapore that were Chinese were mostly descended from peasants in southern China who migrated over as refugees, while a lot of the intelligent scholars still remain in China. So if you have a lot of the smart people still there in China, you can definitely do what Singapore did. And before I go into what Lee Kuan Yew described as the Singapore formula, let me get out of this communist costume. Much better. Okay, so the Singapore formula goes like this. So Lee Kuan Yew told Deng Xiaoping this. Firstly, education reform. Get your people educated. Next, foreign investment to get their Western money. So how this works is that maybe you can do things like tax breaks, make it easier for foreign companies to set up here. And then when more foreign companies set up here in China, they will hire Chinese workers and train them, transfer skills to them to make them more productive. And then when the economy grows and you get more money from taxes, you can then use that money to build public housing for everyone. But at the same time, you must maintain a clean government that promotes the most competent people and crack down on corruption, because that will make people lose faith in government. I'm not going to go into detail about how Singapore became the success that it is. If you're interested in that, you can check out this other video that I did on that topic. And after hearing all this, Deng Xiaoping was like, oh, wow, you can use capitalism to create a society where everyone is cared for, where everyone has housing and social welfare. And Deng Xiaoping went back to China and he thought about it. And he realized that this is the way forward. He wanted to open up China to implement his own reforms. But then he faced opposition from his own party. They were afraid that they will lose power because this whole reform business is going against the direction that the Communist Party has been going for the last few decades. This is a betrayal of the communist principles that Mao Zedong laid out. This allowing private businesses to be run, to open up everywhere. This is crazy. And so they were very afraid that the Chinese people will start to lose faith in the Communist Party because they see this party that's been ruling them for many years say that, look, we are changing course because the way we've been doing things, it's wrong. But Deng Xiaoping told his party members that, look, the people were in a very bad situation and they will just continue to lose faith in the government if their lives do not improve. So yeah, he's a very pragmatic person who just cared about result. To him, if the economy did not improve and people's lives just got worse, the party was gone anyway. In fact, he had this very famous saying, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." So then, he told his officials, there is good social order in Singapore. They govern the place with discipline. We should draw from their experience and do even better than them. 2 years later, in 1980, Deng Xiaoping launched 4 special economic zones: Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, Xiamen. Basically, these places were designed to be experiments for the opening up of the entire country. They will have things like lower tax rates and lower duties on imports, simpler processes to open businesses, and overall just more autonomy from the central government in Beijing. They were like labs trying to emulate the Singapore model. They allowed Deng Xiaoping's government to test if market reforms would really work. They could observe foreign technologies and processes. Then they would implement anything that worked across all over China. In the next few years, these special economic zones showed a lot of promise. It brought in foreign investment, technology, and expertise. Shenzhen, the most promising of them, was barely more than a fishing port in 1981. But then, it brought 50% of all foreign investment into China. And Singapore played a big role in advising China how to manage these special economic zones. In fact, in 1985, the Chinese government appointed ex-Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Goh Keng Swee, as an advisor. His task was to guide the development of all these special economic zones and urban planning in the coastal areas to boost tourism. And all these zones were so successful that China went to add 10 more to capitalize on this success. So why was Singapore the perfect model for China to learn from? Firstly, it was rich and developed, of course, but more importantly, it was tightly controlled by one central government. It had a strong ruling party, the PAP, and most people believe that it was the right party to lead the country. The PAP has won every single election since independence in 1965, easily. This appealed to China because they have one party that ruled the whole of the country. Because the PAP has such a strong grip on power, they could just select their own leaders through their own supposedly meritocratic system. And then the people of Singapore had very high living standards. Nearly everyone owned a home. More than 80% were living in public housing. People weren't starving. Things were orderly. Most people had a job and all kids went to school. There was social stability. To China back then, this wasn't basic stuff. It was something to dream about. Also, Singapore is the only state outside of China and Taiwan that has a majority Chinese population. I know that Singapore is a multicultural country, there are many other races, and these races play really important roles in the society here. But when looking to learn from Singapore, the fact that it is 75% Chinese is a huge plus to China because it proves that a majority Chinese society can modernize without a multi-party democracy. Yes, Singapore is democratic, it has elections, but effectively, the government has been monopolized by one party. And China has only one party in government, the Chinese Communist Party. So we can say that China viewed Singapore as this distant relative that migrated away but became very successful. This example of Singapore being able to modernize while only having one strong ruling party was a very, very big deal because in the 80s and 90s, everyone thought that as countries grew richer, they would become more democratic. Everyone believed that as the middle class grew and become richer and become more open to the world, exposed to new ideas, they would want more freedom and democracy. For example, other East Asian countries like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan were becoming more democratic. Their ruling parties lost their monopoly on power as the country got richer. Singapore was that counter-example. You can have an advanced economy with only one party ruling things in an efficient way with strict social control. It showed that stability, prosperity, and centralized control could all coexist. But then, this whole reforming and opening up of China didn't go smoothly all the way. In 1989, something terrible happened in China. It was the Tiananmen incident. It stopped the whole momentum for reform. I'm not going to go into detail here. There was a huge protest by students and workers against the government. They demanded more transparency from the government, more freedom for the media and free speech. They wanted better social security for the workers, and they were all angry about corruption in the government. The Western media covered the events quite closely. The Chinese government suppressed these protests, wounding and killing hundreds and thousands of protesters. It was a total disaster, which many in the Western media called a massacre. So, many Western countries just chose to stop investing in China because of their handling of the Tiananmen incident. And then just after that, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And a lot of the countries that were under the Soviet Union started to become more democratic. So a lot of the leaders in the Chinese Communist Party, they were very afraid that if China became more open, it would collapse, just like the Soviet Union. And they already saw the signs of this in the Tiananmen incident. So the economy just kind of stagnated. The government slowed down their support for all these reforms, and there was less and less foreign investment. But Deng Xiaoping had a plan to put China back on the right track, and it involved Singapore. At the time in 1992, he was already 88, and he knew that he needed to do something to restart this whole process of China's economic reforms. So he did something really unexpected. He told everyone that he was just going to take a holiday, and then he went on a historic tour of southern China, where most of these special economic zones are. He visited the local officials and met the people, and he basically reignited enthusiasm for all these reforms. And also, very importantly, he told officials to study how Singapore governed its society. And when Deng Xiaoping says something in China, it's like the heavens opened up and an order came down. So the conservative leaders in the party who did not want China to open up even more lost support because Deng Xiaoping's reforms were very popular. And so just in 1992, over 400 Chinese delegations from every province in China visited Singapore to study its systems. And these were the main things that they thought was most valuable to learn from Singapore. Firstly, how to fight corruption. Secondly, how to build public housing for the masses. Thirdly, how to train civil servants to be better government employees. And last but not least, how to manage state enterprises, which are basically companies that are owned by the government. Singapore has quite a few. And with so many visits, Lee Kuan Yew saw the strain on his government. They were all out educating Chinese delegations, taking them away from the work they were supposed to do. And so Lee Kuan Yew proposed that China and Singapore work together on some projects to learn from each other. China could use these projects to learn methods to govern better. It could also gain practical experience and test ideas in controlled environments. At the same time, Singapore could gain access to economic opportunities and test their own new methods. The first of these projects is the Suzhou Industrial Park that was set up in 1994. The goal of it was to copy Singapore's industrial development success. Singapore provided their guidance in urban planning, sending over management teams to help with the setup. The aim was to create a high-tech industrial park. It should be globally competitive and support innovation. Today, the Suzhou Industrial Park generates over $13 billion a year. 25,000 companies are housed here, and 500,000 jobs are created from this project. And next up, with the Tianjin Eco City that started in 2007, China wanted to build a sustainable city from scratch to address the challenges of climate change. Singapore came down to help with the environmental planning, water management, and designing of green buildings. And so the Tianjin Eco City became this test bed for China to experiment and build a model for other cities in China to build in more environmentally friendly ways. And lastly, with the China-Singapore Chongqing Connectivity Initiative that launched in 2015, the goal was to connect the western part of China to Southeast Asia in financial services, aviation, transport and logistics, and technology. Ultimately, both countries just wanted to make trading cheaper and faster. So these projects are very helpful for China because they were practical testing grounds for ways to govern better, how to build better cities, and how to grow industries. And then for Singapore, besides the economic opportunities, we know that we must befriend China because we need to gain some goodwill, as we all know that China is a rising giant. There's a very interesting anecdote here about how China studied and learned from Singapore. And this is by the former Singapore Foreign Minister, George Yeo. He noted that Chinese officials were very interested in Singapore's internet policies, specifically how it blocks websites like pornography or whatever. And he said that China probably took some reference to Singapore's experience to build what is now the Great Firewall of China. But of course, China and Singapore had their fair share of challenging moments. In 2004, before becoming Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong visited Taiwan. This really angered China, which saw this as a challenge to its One China policy. So in reaction, China just froze relations with Singapore. And then in 2016, 9 armored vehicles that belonged to the Singaporean army were impounded in Hong Kong while on the way back to Singapore from Taiwan. Singapore has been for a very long time doing military training in Taiwan, and China was not happy with these military ties. But Singapore told China that it maintained its right to conduct training in Taiwan. Thankfully, these issues were resolved after a lot of back and forth between the two countries. Fast forward now to today, as China has developed into the second largest economy in the world, Singapore's influence as a teacher, a model to follow, is not really a thing anymore. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew told Xi Jinping, China will not be coming to Singapore to learn. Singapore will be going to China to learn. And I agree, I was in China recently, specifically Guangzhou in southern China, and the road was full of electric cars. The infrastructure is really, really developed. Even in Singapore, Chinese-owned companies such as Sea are dominating industries. As a young Singaporean Chinese, this story of Singapore and China makes me appreciate how my identity shapes my outlook. I'm Chinese, but not Chinese. I speak English as my first language. I watch Western shows on Netflix, and by the same time, a lot of the cultural values that I hold is very Chinese. And when I go back to China, I don't feel that unfamiliar. This shared kinship by this Chinese part of a very diverse Singapore in a rapidly developing part of the world, Southeast Asia, makes Singapore very important to China today. But at the same time, as George Yeo said, yes, there is kinship, but we are not family. I believe that all of us have strands of identity running through us that make us who we are. My Chineseness is a very big strand that runs through me. I know the language, I relate to the culture, and personally, I want to maintain that Chineseness, grow more in touch with my roots, and learn more about the motherland at the same time. But I also know that I'm different. And this channel is an exploration of the many stories and perspectives like this. I want to try to connect how we in this part of the world think about who we are and our place in the world we live in. So if you like the message, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.